I would like to first just thank you all for joining us today. My name is Kimberly Bolero, and I'm the director of the Holocaust Education Resource and Outreach Center, or the Hero Center at Voices of Hope here in Connecticut. I know there's a lot of you joining in from other places, so thank you for joining us today. The workshop series was created through the Holocaust and Genocide Education Advisory Committee, which was created to help educators in Connecticut implement state legislation passed in 2018. Normally, we would be holding these summer workshops at various institutions around the state, but we are thrilled to be able to work with you all remotely. Before we start, I do want to do a really quick survey. This should show up on your screen. Just a really quick, anonymous couple of questions about your experience teaching rescue and why you might teach rescue. So does everyone see that? Yes? Okay, good. I see the answers coming in, so that's good. That's great. We just want to get a quick, maybe a little idea of what our audience is doing, what you have done. Okay. Okay. So it looks like most of our audience has done this before, and 100% say a mix of these for why. So that's good. Okay. So we have admit. So we have some experienced teachers here. So all right, thank you for that. Let me see. Let's get rid of that. Okay. Okay, so thank you so much. We will keep everyone muted at this point. If you do have questions or comments throughout the presentation, please feel free to send them through the chat function at the bottom of your screen. We encourage everyone to share their experience, ideas, their challenges, etc., as this will only really help us better teach the topic of rescue. I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Laura Hilton as our presenter today. She is a professor at Muskingum University in Ohio. I had to practice how to say the name of that university before I got on. So thank you for the correction, Laura. And she is also a co-editor of the new book, Understanding and Teaching the Holocaust. This was co-edited with Connecticut's own Dr. Avinoam Pat. And so we were thrilled to be able to welcome her and share her experience and knowledge with all of you. So Dr. Hilton, thank you for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
I'm gonna unmute. Anybody give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Okay, now I'm gonna go over here and attempt to share my screen and start the ubiquitous PowerPoint, because that's how we do things. Okay, so I have been teaching the Holocaust for 19 years. I think there's actually one of my former students who is attending this workshop who was in the very first time I taught it, which is a scary, humbling, and exciting thing all at once. When I teach rescue, I usually teach it embedded in a larger unit that I do about resistance and also collaborators and complicity and beneficiaries. So it's like a piece of a larger whole. And I almost always start my students off, first slide, they're so used to this, with giving them some images that they can kind of dig into. And so I've got 3 of the ones that I typically show in my segment on rescue that are up here. Now, maybe 3 years ago, the Dr. Seuss cartoon, which is up here, people hadn't seen. But this cartoon has been covered. It was in the Atlantic. They did a big segment on it because it's about America First. So the 3 things that I've got up here are going to touch on different aspects of rescue. I used the Dr. Seuss cartoon to explain why it was people might say we don't want to let in somebody who's attempting to escape. So I think that's a cartoon everybody has already seen. The image that is just to the right of it, I am hoping somebody maybe has taught this book or recognizes it. Anybody in the chat know what this book is here to the right? Or you can unmute if you want to. I gotta pop over here to my chat. Oh, but I popped out of my screen share. So since I can't hear anybody, I'm gonna say people know that this is Art Spiegelman's mouse. If
yes, Laura, we had a couple of chat answers, mouse.
Yeah, and I teach this. I usually teach it every third or fourth time that I teach my class because I try to mix up the kinds of memoirs and the geography and what I'm teaching. I have found Spiegelman's mouse to be unbelievably accessible to almost all of my students every time I've taught it. And so in this panel, you have an example of one of the hiding places that his parents hid in. And this is at the time that they were trying to avoid a deportation as their ghetto was being liquidated. Now, the picture that is down here on the right, I understand we have somebody with us who is a survivor, who was part of the kinder transport. This is an image of a group of children who are coming into a port in England. And so this would be an example of a successful rescue. I'll touch on the kinder transport again on a later slide. But I think also the kinder transport is something that is incredibly powerful to teach students about. There was a possibility of rescue. And then you can contrast that with the Dr. Seuss slide. I went and looked up some stats from early Gallup polls. And at the time of the Wagner-Rogers bill in 1939, which is, of course, trying to get to the floors of both the House and the Senate, there's an opinion poll about whether or not we should allow 10,000 Jewish children to come in from Germany and Austria. And when I looked up the stats today, 67% of Americans opposed it. So you can contrast this with what the mood was, at least among some of the American public, versus in England. Certainly the people who were coming in had to be cared for by private families. They were not supposed to draw upon government funding. But contrast that with 67% of Americans who say we should not allow 10,000 Jewish children to come in per year for 2 years between 39 and 40. Okay, unless there are major questions, I'm gonna click. All right, so goals of today's session, and I'm very happy to send this PowerPoint to Kimberly if anybody wants it, so please don't feel like you have to scribble down notes. Lots of people in here have already been teaching this, so kind of rethink what your rationale, what your learning objectives are for teaching rescue. Defining different kinds of rescue. When I was a novice teacher, I think I would have defined rescue much more narrowly than how I understand it and teach it today. And I think that is a good thing to look at different kinds of rescue. In terms of the scholarship, I think this is something that's been more discussed in the past maybe 10 to 15 years. That Jews helping each other also counts as rescue. And it's been a little bit strange, I think, for some people to kind of make this transition. Can you define Jews helping other Jews as rescue? And I always kind of come back with the question, that depends on how you're defining rescue, and maybe think about why you're defining it to not include Jews helping other Jews. It's a weird thing, which I would love to hear people's comments on. As I said before, when I teach rescue, I teach it within the larger picture. I embed it within resistance, anti-Nazi resistance in general versus resistance specifically by Jews, the role of bystanders, the role of collaborators, particularly in Eastern Europe, but also in places like France and Belgium and the Netherlands. I want to share a few specific examples today. And I think my role today is really to give a broad framework and get us thinking about this. And many of the other sessions that then follow from this, we can really dig into specific issues, but I want to just share a few of the examples that I teach. This is one that I think we all wrestle with. Sometimes we might have students who come into our class, or we might have coworkers, or we might have family members or friends, and their idea of rescue is based on a couple of really high profile examples. When we get to the slide about hiding, most people know who Anne Frank is. When we talk about rescuing people by saying, I need them for labor, people are going to think about Schindler's List. When we talk about helping people hide in the forests, maybe people have seen the Defiance movie about the Bielski brothers out in Bielorussia. How is it that the public understanding and our students' understanding of those very high-profile forms of rescue, how might that skew how possible rescue actually was on the ground? So that's one of the things I'd like people to think about as we go through today. So how possible was rescue and why? When I was writing my chapter on rescue and resistance for the volume I co-edited with Avi, I was trying to find out how many people lived in the portions of Europe that were directly occupied by the Nazis. And the best number I could come to was about 700 million people. Let me make sure I got that, and it wasn't 70 million. This is when I have to switch from my reading glasses. No, 700 million people in Europe, areas that are directly controlled by the Nazis or their collaborators. When we talk about rescue, I think one of the reasons we talk about it is we have to give the people who we're communicating with, our students, a glimmer of hope, so they are not like, every single person in Europe did absolutely nothing to mitigate what the Nazis were doing with their collaborators to attempt to murder 11 million Jews, right? We teach rescue because we have to provide hope that some people still tried to work against that formidable system. At the same time, I think we need to temper it and say, rescue is not always possible in every place at the same level. And I think that's a really important point for students to understand. And embedding what we're doing in terms of teaching these specific examples with geography and timing, particularly in terms of the war, I think is critically important to helping students understand this point. Did they have the likelihood of outside assistance? Did they have support from local community? Was there any kind of shared sense of solidarity? If there's Jewish resistance and they are somewhere in Eastern Poland / Western Ukraine, it's highly unlikely that the Poles or Ukrainians who might be offering resistance are going to offer the Jews assistance as well, right? So sometimes you have resistance groups who are not there, even though they're resisting maybe the same group, they are not necessarily working together. Something I have become more savvy about, again, as I've continued to teach this topic, the roles played by gender, the roles played by age, and the roles played by demography. And we will, on a later slide, talk specifically about two cases, Les Chambon, which is in southern France, and also the Danish rescue effort that happens in the fall of 1943. In terms of gender and age, you might be more likely to hide a young woman, and a young woman who didn't look overtly Jewish, or at least the way the Nazis believed all Jews looked. You might be more apt to hide a child who is maybe 10 or 12 versus a younger child who is maybe 2 or 3. Because maybe the 2 or 3-year-old, it might be difficult, more difficult for you to keep that child quiet and make sure that that child did not give away a hiding place. So the roles that we play here, and not just see all Jews just as Jews, but also understand that who those Jews were, that may have played a role. You're going to be very loath to hide somebody who is a male, who is Jewish, who's in their 20s, because most males who are in their 20s at that time are supposed to be either on the war front or assisting the war effort working in a factory. So I think these are important things to think about as we talk about rescue. I'm going to go through just 4 types of rescue today. That doesn't mean that there aren't other subcategories, but we're going to talk about hiding Jews, helping Jews pass as non-Jews. And if this is something that you haven't thought a lot about, I'd highly recommend Gunnar Paulson's book that he writes about what happens within Warsaw, about Jews passing as non-Jews, either Poles or Aryans on the Aryan side. The example of Schindler protecting Jews and saying you're protecting them because they have economic or labor value. And then the 4th one is this issue of enabling escape, either in-country networks or some of the diplomatic intervention that happens. And again, I'm going to give you many examples. We may not cover them all in depth depending on time, but at least to put those names and those faces in front of you. Okay, two things I always emphasize with my students, and I think sometimes this gets lost and maybe romanticized a bit in some of the Hollywood versions of rescue. Rescue is rare. Most of the 700 million of Europeans did not engage in rescue for their fellow countrymen or for Jews who are attempting to find some kind of assistance in the country they're in. It's incredibly dangerous. And this last point, that it's illegal. I'm not going to say that all of us follow all laws at all times in our daily lives, but most people have been acculturated from an early age to follow laws. It's really difficult mentally and emotionally to move to a place in your life where you're in the habit of breaking laws versus not breaking laws for an average person. So I always try to emphasize that. And last point here, individuals who are being rescued or who are rescuing other people, they endure tremendous mental and emotional strain. They are on their guard all the time. And I think that in most years, saying that might not maybe resonate with us the way it resonates this year because of the pandemic and because of other issues going on in our country. Lots of people are under tremendous mental and emotional strain and worried, maybe more so than they would have been this year at last time when we all were able to go outside of our houses and also hopefully have electricity. Okay, I'm going to flip this on its head, and rather than start with why would people help Jews, I'm going to roll through several reasons why they wouldn't help them. Top on my list, they were anti-Semitic. And here I'm following scholarly kind of protocol. I do not hyphenate anti-Semite. If you want to read more about this, I'd highly suggest you read Peter Hayes. It's like pages 3 to 5 in his new book that he writes about the Holocaust. There's no such thing as Semitic. This is a made-up term. So I'm purposely using anti-Semitic, and I train my students to say they might be anti-Semitic religiously. It might be a cultural anti-Semitism. It might be a political anti-Semitism. There are a lot of kinds of anti-Semitism. But there are people who would not literally help Jews because they did not like Jews, and maybe they even hated Jews. Maybe they benefited from Jews being rounded up and deported. And here I have an image which I've chosen deliberately because I think sometimes when we talk about collaboration, we think collaboration is mainly male. Here's a group of women who are marching in the Ukraine. They are part of a Ukrainian nationalist group who work directly with the SS. And you have Ukrainians who directly move into the homes of Jews who were deported to ghettos or murdered on site. They live in their homes, they sleep in their beds, they eat off their dishes at their tables. So there are reasons why people might have benefited from either the persecution or the deportation of Jews. Depending on where they are, their local needs and goals might take precedent. If you're in the city of Paris and it is July of 1940 and you have come underneath direct Nazi occupation, you might be more concerned with protecting your family and protecting your business rather than worried about Jews who live several streets over in a different neighborhood. This is a real one. If you are within Germany or in what the Germans referred to as the Reich Ost, so the land that they had acquired directly to the east of Germany, and you were caught helping somebody who is Jewish, it was a death penalty. It's not always the death penalty, and I try to give multiple examples to my students about this. In the Netherlands in 1943, the standard punishment was 6 months in a concentration camp. In places like France and Belgium, there actually was not a case where you would have one standard policy that applied to everyone. But if you were within Germany, if you were within the general occupation, the central portion of Poland, and you were caught helping somebody who is Jewish, you would get the death penalty. And I would say that that is a deterrent, but I would also remind my students that that is still a choice. I think to many people within Europe, and not to be cynical, but I think that this creeps in a little bit more maybe post-1945 in memory. They didn't know what to do because the problem seemed so overwhelming. And I'm not dismissing this point. I think it's a really important point. In a case like Poland, where you have 3 million Jews in 1939, to help the Jews writ large, how do you help 3 million people? As opposed to Denmark, where you have around 8,000 Jews, maybe that seems more manageable. But I think in certain places and certain times, the idea that you would help Jews seems very overwhelming. They might be people themselves who are being persecuted. In 1939, when the German army rolls over the border into Poland, they are pretty violent and vicious towards Polish populations. They wholesale move Polish populations from the lands they directly annex, and they move them into the general government section, or they move them to Germany as forced laborers. There are other people who are being persecuted, and they're not being persecuted at the same level, of course, the Jews are being persecuted. But it's difficult, I think, sometimes for them to pick up their heads when they themselves feel like they are also under the gun, so to speak. Okay, that was a pretty depressing but necessary slide. Here's a different set of slides. Why would people help Jews? I train my students to look at studies that are done by several people. Block and Drucker do a study of 105 rescuers. And Eva Fogelman, who was herself born to a Holocaust survivor in a DP camp in Germany in the late 1940s, she does a study with 300 rescuers, as well as the Jews that they have rescued. So they look at people who are directly involved in rescue, and in Fogelman's case, also some of the Jews who they have rescued personally. And here are the things they find out. Common characteristics by people who engaged in rescue during the Holocaust. And I would say that this is applicable to other cases. For instance, I'm really interested in the workshop that will come up next that looks at rescue during the genocide within Rwanda. There's a common band of humanity. They understand that people are not all the same, but they respect that there's difference. So in terms of how people are hardwired, so to speak, how they are raised, how they are inculcated, whatever their cultural values are. They reject a binary us versus them worldview. So a second characteristic of people who tend to rescue that comes out of these two studies, they don't just put everybody in us and them. And for everybody in here, because you understand the Nazi worldview ran off of us and them. You are either with us or you are not. So these are people who are working against the grain in that respect. A third thing, they have a clear sense of right and wrong. And it's not just understanding there's a problem. They're willing to take action based on the problem that they see. So again, a third characteristic that comes out of these studies. Their default is to practice kindness and compassion towards others. So there are lots of things I could say about the world and the position we are in right now, but I will maybe leave that for the chat or side conversations with whoever you're going to talk to later today. Practice kindness and compassion towards others. That is their instinct, and that is a value that they try to practice on a regular basis. Last, certainly not least, they tend to be more independent. They tend to be self-sufficient. They tend not to follow the crowd. And there are times that I roll out these ideas to my students and they seem a little bit like that's a big ask to try to do that every single day. And I try to explain to them that if these are things that are important to do and these are your value systems, that they become natural and eventually they become just like breathing. This is the way you see the world and this is the way you approach other humans. Okay, second set of why it is people help Jews. Samuel and Pearl Alliner, again, I'm sure you're familiar with their work. They write a very famous book in the late 1980s called The Altruistic Personality. Samuel Alliner was born in Eastern Poland, and he originally lived on his grandparents' farm. He is ghettoized along with his family, and when that ghetto is liquidated, he actually escapes, and a Polish family takes him in, and he lives with them, basically with a hidden identity. He passes himself off as somebody who is Polish with their assistance, and survives the Holocaust basically in one of the ways we're about to talk about with rescue. So they do something a little different. They study people who rescued. They study the people who were rescued, but then they also have sort of this control group, people who were in these regions at this time who did not engage in rescue. So it's a little bit different than the two studies that were on the previous slide. A lot of commonalities here, and Samuel Alliner has a PhD in sociology, so he comes at it a little bit differently than the previous people who are trained in psychology. And then his wife Pearl has a PhD in education. So strong and cohesive family bonds, super important characteristic of people who were rescued. This is something that does not pop up on the psychology side. And I think that is because in terms of sociology, you're always looking not just at the individual, but their family and their community. Individuals who had consistently close contacts with Jews were more likely to rescue Jews. So people who had worked with Jews, who saw them as humans, who lived with them, who traded with them, who depended on them because the Jews were cattle traders in a town in Germany, whatever it was. If you had regular and close contact with Jews, you were more apt to actually rescue Jews. This is similar to one of the points on the previous slide, strong sense of responsibility for welfare and improvement of society as a whole, that you took this to heart, that you played a role in making the world around you into a better place. And lastly, that you identify with humans as humans, and this is similar to the previous bullet point about not dividing the world into us and to them. Okay. Hiding Jews. Basic realities. The vast majority of Jews do not go into hiding until they absolutely have to. You're somebody who has survived and you're in Stuttgart and it's 1942 and you get your deportation notice. You understand that going into hiding is going to be incredibly difficult. So people don't generally go into hiding unless they absolutely have to. And for many Jews, if you're in Germany, it is a deportation notice that you're given once they begin transports to the east, to one of the camps or to the ghettos. Or if you're in a ghetto and that ghetto is being liquidated. And again, to come back to Spiegelman and Maus, you see this happen multiple times to his parents. Again, the role that is played by gender and age, as I said earlier, it is very, very difficult to hide if you are a young Jewish man and you're in your 20s and 30s. I talk about with students that Jews at this point in Europe, if you're male, you're circumcised. They are surprised that this was not the norm because in their world today, it is the norm in America that males are circumcised at birth. But that is a pretty clear way that you can tell whether or not a male is Jewish or not. And so your gender plays a role in whether or not somebody might be less apt to hide you and whether or not it might be more difficult for you to find a hiding place. I said this before, I'll say it again. It's incredibly dangerous and it's also illegal. Morally and ethically just, but there could be punishment for you, and depending on where you live, that punishment could be draconian, it could be the loss of your life, it could be the loss of family members. Contrary to the example of Anne Frank, great book. I wish more school children today would read Diary of Anne Frank. My daughter in 6th grade read The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. I have lots of opinions about the book and about the movie. I tried to work with them internally rather than work them out with my daughter who was 11 at the time. But Anne Frank, if that is the book that people have read about hiding, they think it's normal for there to be 8, 9, 10 people in a hiding place. That's not the norm. It's so much harder to hide and for people to provide you with food and provide you with security and protection. And it's also incredibly hard to hide if you have children, particularly young children, as I talked about earlier. Rare to stay in one place. And again, here is where a popular conception of hiding, the example of Anne Frank, maybe works against student understanding of this point. Usually people had to move multiple times. This summer I read a new book out that is by Mark Roseman, and in it he talks about a specific group who had Jews in it and also who helped to hide Jews. It is fascinating how he has been able to find, it's called Rebuilding Lives, came out in 2019, how many times people have to be moved and how difficult it is to convince different members of this group to take on Jews at different points, depending on what their circumstances are. This is a hard logistical point, but I think it's super important. If you're going to hide somebody, you need to be able to feed them. And food rations, if you're in a place like Germany or Poland, particularly 1943 and onward, you might not have enough food to feed yourself and your family. And now you also need to keep a little bit of aside to hide one or maybe more people whom you're hiding. What happens if somebody becomes incredibly ill? You can't take them to a doctor. Are you going to try to find this person identification cards so they can actually be outside of a bunker or a hiding place, like in a field or in a barn? It's really difficult for average people to do these things. And again, when they do them, it's risky, it's dangerous, and it's also illegal. For Jews who want to go into hiding, it's super expensive. And who's to say that you're not going to hand over all of your belongings and trust somebody that you say that you can hide there for 6 months because you've given them X, and they take your belongings and the next day they report you to the local police and they turn you in. You could give somebody literally all you have left. And there's a reader that's put out by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum that has this gripping story of this couple who are trying to hide with a newborn infant, and how basically the Polish peasants take advantage of them and they take all of their stuff and then they turn them in. It's super expensive to pay for assistance and for safety, and there's no guarantee that once you have paid for a certain amount that they're going to let you stay beyond that, because they are taking that risk. The mental health aspects, as I said earlier, you have to be consciously all the time worried about somebody denouncing you, a neighbor, somebody who happens to stop by, somebody who notices that you go out to the field at an odd time every single night. One of the examples I use with my students is there was a Jewish family who was being hidden by farmers in the Ukraine, and in order to help them, they peeled their potatoes for them. And a policeman stopped by the farmhouse and he looked in the pail where the potato peels were, and he questioned why they were peeling their potatoes like Jews did. And until I read this anecdote, I had never heard of this before. But supposedly Jews peeled potatoes in one long strip, so it's a twirl, whereas Ukrainians tended to do small stabby strips. So here you have a Ukrainian policeman who comes in, looks in the pile of stuff that maybe you're going to use for compost or feed your pigs or whatever. Why do your potato peels look like Jews peel potatoes? Like, that is a level of heightened awareness that I think is pretty astonishing. And that anecdote usually, I think, resonates with students. You don't know who you can trust. You had to depend on strangers. There are lots of different studies that are out there about this. Seligman is one person who's done a study, and for every 65 Jews, they had to have at least 300 people help them. So it's not just one person helping you, there's multiple people helping, particularly if Jews are moving from place to place. Always a good reminder. When I have memoirs and I assign them in class, it could be All About My Life by Gerda Weissman Klein or From Ashes to Life by Lucille Eichengreen. The students know when they're reading that memoir, can they just get to April or May of 1945? Right? They should know, hopefully, when the war ends. But for Jews who are in hiding, they have no idea how many more days, how many more weeks, how many more months it's going to be. And the psychological strain of not knowing how much longer you have to endure this wears on people. And for those who hide by themselves, they might be constantly alone. And I think that that is something we should also take into account when we teach these stories about being in hiding. Not to say that we shouldn't appreciate the individuals who helped to hide Jews, but I think we also need to come back to the experiences of what it was like to actually be hidden. So at that same time. Okay, so survival by passing as non-Jews. Can you speak the language? If you are somebody who has been raised in the western portion of Poland, which prior to 1919 had been part of Germany, maybe you're also fluent in German. But it's going to be very, very difficult for you if you are somebody who is Jewish, who has maybe been able to get out of the Warsaw Ghetto, to then move into the area directly controlled by the Germans and pass yourself off if you cannot speak German or Polish. If the only language you have at your disposal is Yiddish, that is going to be a dead giveaway that, of course, you're somebody who is Jewish. So the role of language in terms of passing yourself off, basically living a double life, as it were. The role of physical appearance, again, I come back to incredibly difficult for young males or male Jews in general to pass themselves off as non-Jews, but also for women, for children, for people who maybe were more elderly. The Nazis had a stereotypical view of what it looked like to be Jewish. That being said, there were lots of Jews who had blonde hair and they had blue eyes. They did not look stereotypically Jewish. So could you use your physical appearance to your advantage? To go back to Maus, one of the things that Vladek worries a lot about with his wife Anya is that she looks too Jewish. Whereas he thinks he looks Aryan enough to be able to pass himself off as somebody who is non-Jewish. As I've said before, the role of gender, particularly the issue of circumcision. If you are passing yourself off as a Pole or a German or Ukrainian or someone who's French or Belgian or Italian, whatever it is, you are living a double life and you are doing something that's illegal. And I think most of us would be ill-prepared to live a completely illegal life. You got to get fake documents. You need ID cards. You need a ration card. You need maybe some kind of a work card. It's really hard for you to get those. Marion Kaplan, in her great work, Between Dignity and Despair, talks about people taking identification cards off of corpses after bombing raids in German cities so they could have authentic papers. Like, papers were that important if you were going to try to live basically above ground as opposed to being in hiding underground. Ability to think on your feet. And here I have another example that is from Spiegelman's. It's one of the early chapters in volume 1. And it's when he has been sent home and he is on a train and he has, in this image that you see in the image on the left-hand side, he puts on a pig mask. So he essentially pretends to be Polish and he says to the conductor, you know, I don't have the documents I'm supposed to have, but here I am in my Polish uniform and I'm going to pretend to be Polish. And in the second panel, he talks about how he's going to play on we both don't like the Nazis. And this is how he's actually able to reunite with his family. So that happens, it's in chapter 3 or 4, one of the very early chapters in volume 1 of Maus. Psychological pressures of playing a role. You have to be on 24/7. You can never let your guard down if you are passing in public as somebody who is purporting to be somebody who's non-Jewish. So the psychological pressures of always being on, I think, are something important to explain to students. All right. Using labor to protect Jews from deportation. I'm going to just give you 3 very quick examples. One time I popped up this picture in my class and someone said, "Who is that man?" And I said, "That is Oskar Schindler." And they're like, "That's not what Oskar Schindler looks like." And I said, okay, there's the Oskar Schindler who played him in the movies, and then there's the actual Oskar Schindler. I'm not going to talk at length about him because I think most people know about his story and how he uses labor in order to save the lives of hundreds of Jews. And that's originally from his factory in Krakow in Poland. He is, however, not the only individual to do this. And in the past 10 to 15 years, we've uncovered multiple examples of people who rescue Jews, usually saving them from imminent deportation, from either a ghetto or a labor camp being liquidated. This gentleman who is standing on the stairs with his child, his name is Hermann Grabe. He actually plays a role in the Nuremberg trials. He gives testimony. And he runs a labor battalion in Volhynia in the Ukraine. And he actually saves several hundred Jews' lives by saying that he needs them to work in his labor detail. A third example of this from Vilna in Lithuania is Major Plaga, who again, he is somebody who is part of the system. These people work directly for the Nazis, and in that way they're collaborators, but they're collaborators who use their power in order to rescue. In his case, he runs this giant, it's like a machine shop in order to fix tanks and to fix trucks and things for the Wehrmacht, for the German army. And he employs hundreds and hundreds of people, and he keeps building on to essentially his workshop in order to employ more and more Jews. And he warns them when they are at risk of being deported, and saves the lives of a couple hundred of Jews in that. Okay, 2 case studies, because I feel like I've been talking a lot, and then I'm gonna put up my diplomatic rescue slide and just let you see some of those names again. I can have Kimberly send this out to everybody so they have it in front of them. But the 2 case studies that I teach for enabling escape, the first one is a town in Les Chambon, which, as you can see from the map, is located down in the southwest corner of France. It's fairly close to both the Italian and the Swiss border. This is a story that you're probably, many of you are already familiar with, but it is a town where 2 Protestant pastors, they are Huguenots, so they're French Calvinists, which is unusual in this very Catholic rural portion of France. And these 2 pastors, here you have Pastor Trachma with his wife Magda, they essentially set up a system working not only with Les Chambon, but with a whole group of villages that are in this area on this plateau. And between 1940 and when they're liberated by the Allies in the late summer of 44, they successfully hide and rescue 5,000 people. 3,500 of them were Jews, and the vast majority of Jews that they rescue are children. And again, I come back to age and I come back to gender. They are in a portion of France that is not easily accessible. They're on a plateau. There's only one road up and down this mountain where they're on a plateau on the top of it. They can see the Nazis coming. That's an important logistical piece to it, but I think the major factor is these are individuals who have a heritage of being religiously persecuted and being a minority group. And that when religious figures inside this community stand up and they say to the people, we're going to assist individuals who are fleeing the Nazis, because we do not believe that the Vichy government, the collaborationist government, is the right government for France. And they're also anti-Nazi. And when you have 2 religious leaders who say, how can you help? That is a completely different situation than what you tend to see, particularly in Eastern Europe, where the how can we help you is a very rare question that get asked, particularly with large numbers. So as I said, they save 5,000 people. Here is a great picture of one of the teachers with a group of Jewish school children. The vast majority of villagers in Les Chambon and the surrounding villages took in literally hundreds of people at a time. They fed them. They provided them with a safe place to be. In terms of the feeding, to come back to the issue of food and its scarcity, the fact that this is a rural area and food was more abundant there, I think plays a very important role. They also set up escape routes, not only into neutral Switzerland, but also the province of Italy that directly borders the area where Les Chambon lies just to the west of. There were actually Italian soldiers who were helping Jews escape over that border. So that's like a whole story for another day, but not today. Another one of my faves is I always talk about Denmark, and I think, Kimberly, you said that there's a boat in Connecticut. One of the boats that was used is actually in Connecticut that you could go and see. Denmark, as I said before, there's about 8,000 Jews total in the country. So you're dealing with a population that it maybe seems more manageable in order to assist that small of a group of numbers. Denmark has been underneath direct German occupation since 1940, since March of 1940, but they are allowed to have their own government, at least to the summer of 1943. The people of Denmark did not see Jews as Jews first. They saw them as Danes who were Jewish. And I think that worldview is really important as opposed to some of the political anti-Semitism maybe you see in a place like Poland or France, where they say they're Jews who live in Poland or who live in France versus seeing them as French or Polish. In October of 1943, Hitler decides that it is time to deport the 8,000 Jews of Denmark. I can get into this in the Q&A if people want to know why then. But it is very well established that multiple high-ranking Germans, there's a guy by the name of Georg Duckwitz, as well as Werner Best, who actually go and warn the Jewish community. And they were going to do the roundup on Yom Kippur, which is going to add, of course, insult to injury. But the rabbi was able to use his communication from his synagogue to warn the Jews of Denmark to basically go into hiding. And then the people of Denmark began to figure out a way to get them to Sweden. Had this happened in 1941, I don't know that Sweden would have allowed 8,000 Danish Jews to come across the waters as you see on the yellow arrows on my map. By October of 43, the Germans are in a different place militarily, and Sweden, which has been at least nominally neutral, we can talk about that also if you would like, they're willing to take that risk now. I don't know that they would have taken that risk in 1941 when the Wehrmacht looked unstoppable, at least until they get, of course, to Russia. You have people who are ferrying individuals. This is a highly mobile society on the water. Tons of people fish for a living. And here in October of 1943, you have not only a place who's willing to give them refuge, but individuals who are ready to help them escape. So I think that that is two crucial pieces to this. Here is one of the boats. I don't know if this is the boat that is in Connecticut, but the results are the vast majority of Jews do manage to escape. They do manage to get to Sweden. They are welcomed by the Swedish people. They are given food, they're given medical care, they're given schooling. Some of them get employment there. So again, I think that's different than a lot of the other stories we might talk about with rescue and why it is difficult in terms of being the receiving country. And for the 200 or 300 Jews who were caught, the Danish government insisted that they be sent to Theresienstadt, which in terms of concentration camps was theoretically a better camp, whatever that means in our hierarchy of concentration camps. And they actually sent the Danish Red Cross in to monitor that their countrymen were being treated properly. So again, that is a different take. Okay, organized rescue. This is my last slide, I promise. You guys have been troopers as I'm moving us through this pretty quickly. Organized rescue, it matters in terms of timing and the place vis-a-vis the war. You see more rescue in 39, 40, and 41. And then again at the end of the war when the Nazi grip is much looser in 44 and 45. It's relatively rare to see major rescue efforts happen between late 42 and early 44. So timing and place, and this is dictated by the war effort, I think is super important. Of course, the Kindertransport, 10,000 children moved mostly to the UK. There are a smaller number that are moved to Switzerland. This was in the materials that Kimberly distributed, but I sometimes show a portion of Into the Arms of Strangers, which I think is a PBS film. Really gets students thinking about what it might take for a parent to put their child on a train knowing that they may or may not ever see them again. Some great oral histories that are in there. 3 different examples, and again, these may already be familiar to you, but if they are not, you have the example of the guy who worked for Philips, the electric company. Sorry for the people who don't have power to remind you of that. He was somebody who wasn't a diplomat, but the diplomat where he was in Lithuania from the Netherlands had to leave, and he left this guy in charge, and this guy started to write visas. And with the help of a Japanese diplomat who was also stationed in Lithuania, who gave them transit, basically, we're going to allow you to go all the way out through Russia and you can come to Japan. It is more than 2,000 people who they diplomatically rescue. Another example would be Aristes Mendez, who is from Portugal, who against the express wishes of the Portuguese government, he's actually going to be recalled from his post, and he dies in debt and in disgrace. His story has recently got a little bit more attention, and he's been rehabilitated in Portugal. But he wrote something like 30,000 visas for Jews who are moving from southern France who are trying to get into neutral Portugal. And again, we can talk about how neutral Portugal was too. Of these three, the one, if you've heard of him, this is probably the one you've heard of, the Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, who moves into Hungary in the really chaotic period where the Hungarian government's been overthrown. The Klizi, the fascists, are in charge basically of running the streets. The Soviets are coming in from the east. The Germans are retreating. And he sets up safe houses and begins to offer diplomatic safety to hundreds and hundreds of people, particularly in this capital city of Budapest. An example, there's a great new book that came out last year about the War Refugee Board, and one of the documents for our breakout sessions deals with the one place in the United States where people were allowed to come in. And here I have a second example of a Dr. Seuss cartoon that I use, and I don't know how well you can see it, but this is an image of Pierre Laval, who was the vice premier of France. And essentially, he is rather anti-Semitic. And in France, they are not assisting Jews with getting out. Instead, they are helping the Nazis, of course, transport them in many, many cases, particularly for stateless Jews, to Auschwitz, from whence they do not return. In-country networks, two to just mention, Piet Meerborg, which is in the Netherlands, and the Committee for the Defense of the Jews, which is in Belgium. If you want particular things to read on those two, I have definitely a reading list for you. And then to link with where we are going in upcoming sessions after the next session, which is about rescue during Rwanda, we have two different cases that this whole series of workshops is going to cover. Okay, I am going to turn things back over to Kimberly, and I hope there's lots and lots of discussion. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was really amazing, and a lot of information, but I think you really covered so many important points. So we do have a question from our friend Seth in New York.
Okay.
And he says, how do you explain Schindler's motivations to students? Why did he rescue? He doesn't fit neatly into the criteria outlined earlier.
Yeah, and that's why I love to sort of blow up this idea that there were Nazis and collaborators, everybody else, and then people who were victims. Like, along the human spectrum, people are going to move in and out of those groups. I don't know how many people still show the entirety of Schindler's List within a class. That is a long movie to show, and if you only have X number of hours to devote to a unit or a course on the Holocaust, you know, we have to pick and choose. I would come back to the point that is raised by the Ahleners, that those who dealt with Jews on a daily basis began to recognize them as fully human, just as they are human. And that when Oskar Schindler, I mean, he's a member of the Nazi Party. He at one point is spying for the Germans. The Czechs arrest him for this. He's gathering like troop transport info and stuff in 38 and 39. He clearly is somebody who is out to make money. But there's a point at which being in contact with these people and seeing their suffering close and up, like right there, he cannot turn off that portion of his humanity that says, you can't just see them, you have to take action, right? And there's this series of things. I recognize you are suffering. I understand that you are suffering. I'm actually going to do something about your suffering. So I use that to explain how it's possible for people, like one of the other examples that I gave, this guy is in the Wehrmacht. He fixes tanks and trucks for a living so the army can continue to kill people. At the same time, he uses Jews as mechanics to fix those trucks. Like, I don't know if that answered your question, but I mean, this is about the complexity and the power of humans to actually change, maybe for the ethically better. Was that too Pollyanna?
I think that's a great way of looking at it. And Seth, comments that the movie is what makes it seem that the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto is that turning point in
Right.
his motivation. So I am wondering, so I know it's 4:00, and so if anybody does have somewhere to be, we won't feel bad if you have to leave us. But Laura, I was wondering, because we are really fortunate to have so many wonderful Holocaust scholars and experts in our area, and we have a wonderful community of survivors here in the greater Hartford area. But we do know also that, so especially in Connecticut, we have a legislation that covers, you must teach Holocaust and genocide. And so we're still working with teachers on how to best implement both of those things into their curriculum. What would you say? Would you have tips or advice for teachers who are either familiar with teaching the Holocaust or maybe new to teaching other genocides, and how this material transcends different examples? I know we will go into that a little bit more in the next sessions, but maybe if you had some advice for them.
I mean, I have some things to say about Rwanda, but since that's the next session, I'm actually going to go backwards in time to what happens in Armenia. There are multiple documented cases where you have diplomats who attempt to intervene. Henry Morgenthau, who is Secretary of the Treasury during the Holocaust in the US administration, his dad was a diplomat in Armenia. And his dad witnessed seeing individuals who were being moved. You have a German medic who sneaks into one of the camps and takes pictures. And he then later writes to Hitler and basically says, why are you doing this to the Jews? It's like what the Ottomans were doing to the Armenians. You have people who were nurses, who were involved with voluntary agencies like the Red Cross in terms of Armenia, who are speaking out and saying, we're not supposed to be doing these certain things, but we're doing these other things when we can get access to people. So I think it's about looking at the community that is surrounding this, and in particular, how some of those outside groups can use their leverage and use their authority to offer some kind of assistance. So when I teach the Armenian genocide, those are some of the examples that I use about rescue.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So I think so we still have a number of our participants on here. If everyone has maybe 5 minutes, I would like to maybe go into the breakout rooms for 5 minutes, and then we can come back and have a quick conversation. Okay, I think everyone's back. So maybe we can, I'm actually going to have you all unmute yourselves, and maybe you can tell me a little bit about what you talked about, and really, I think really the point of this was really just to get people thinking about the complexity of rescue and what that looked like. And so can anyone maybe bring up something they thought was interesting or new or?
Well, I guess for me, it's like we got the segment on Fort Ontario, and Ruth actually was there. So we've got a kind of an eyewitness to history right in front of us.
Yes. I found that out today when she emailed me and said, oh, did you know this? I said, no, I didn't. Complete coincidence. Okay, thank you, Libby. Anyone else have something that they maybe learned that was new or interesting or?
Well, I had a chance to talk to Katie about Laura's class at Muskingum University. And about the university, that was interesting. But also, I thought our example was fascinating. And I wondered about the legacy of the Jewish community that was established in the Dominican Republic. I wonder if there's any information about that.
I'm sure there is. Like I said, I don't know too much about them. I know that the Jewish community there still exists. I don't know, Laura, if you have any information on that specifically. But yeah, it's an interesting, I think it's an interesting case in the time where no one else was willing to take refugees, but also the motivation behind Trujillo's decision and agreement to do that. All right.
And I thought that Laura's answer about Oskar Schindler was good. It was very plausible.
Thanks. I try to be plausible.
Well, but also, there's a version of a class that I teach where we study the Oskar Schindler from the perspective of Aristotle's, say, character-driven ethics. And it's about having the character to make a choice that is sort of in opposition to one's conditioning or habituation. So it's about that strong character that comes from other sources where you know it's the right thing to do for the right reasons.
Yeah, that's cool.
Well, I see it's 4:15 and we spent more than 5 minutes doing that. So, but I would like to thank all of you for being here for our first virtual workshop, and I hope you'll join us again next Monday. And we've got 4 more after this, so you are more than welcome to join us. Thank you, Dr. Hilton. This was such an incredible presentation, and I'm so thrilled that you were able to join us, and thank you so much. So the last thing before you go, we have one more just quick question for anyone who's willing to answer before you go, just to let us know how we're doing. And this is something that's new for us, and so if there's any feedback or any questions or comments that you have for us, I'll put my email address in the chat box, and please send us any ideas, any questions, or anything like that to us, and we're happy to have that feedback. So thank you again so much, and we hope to see you again soon.
When's the next workshop?
The next one is Monday, August 10th, and so
okay.
we'll be doing Beyond Hotel Rwanda.
Okay, that's great. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, it's very exciting. All right, well, thank you all so much, and stay safe.
Thanks.
Have a wonderful afternoon, and we hope to see you all again soon.
Great.
All right. Bye.